What is a story? You know, it's a question that I get all the time, and all my journalism students are asking me, what's a story? And the editors are always asking me, what's a story? And I've been writing about food now for about past 12 years. And of course, food is not a story. Food is just food. And so the question is always, how do you find that story to tell about food? And so what I'd like to introduce you to today is a simple way I think about story, and it has to do with structure. So I'd like to introduce just a very basic structural elements that I use to make a story a story. And so I was doing a book a couple of years back called A Short History of the American Stomach. And so yeah, it's from the first Thanksgiving, that's where we were supposed to start, all the way to the present day. And of course, what is the present day? My editor said, well, the present day has got to be food media. Food media. So I thought, okay, great, I'll write about the Food Network. So she said, fabulous, that'll be the last chapter, I'll write about the Food Network. And so, of course, as a writer that I am, as soon as I sell a story one place, I want to sell it someplace else. So I called my editor at Harper's and I said, I want to write a story about the Food Network. And he said, what's the story? So as I usually do, I go to academic listservs and academic ideas, because that's where the ideas are. And because every story has an idea in it. Now, the problem is, of course, that an idea is not a story. But a story needs an idea. So I started trolling around these academic listservs looking for ideas about food media. And of course, I knew it when I saw it. It was, the idea was gastroporn. Right. Food porn, it became it's become a big deal. It wasn't back then. So I called my editor at Harper's. I got a great story. It's gastroporn. It was like, boom, sold. Didn't have to pitch, nothing. None of those Adam Gopnik meetings. They liked that story. That was like, of course, what was the problem was that it's not a story. There was no story there. It was just an idea. And I kept on thinking, how am I going to tell this story? How am I going to tell this story? What is this story? What am I going to do? And I knew that I would have to worm my way onto the set of the Food Network, right? Because I knew I would need, a scene and maybe a character and something like this. But I also know that a scene and a character does not make a story. That's just a scene. That's just a character. So I knew that, and I kept on thinking, how am I going to make gastroporn into an actual story once I wormed my way onto the set? And I couldn't figure it out. And it was getting close to the deadline, and I finally called an old friend of mine named Marcy, who has worked as a publicist in the film industry for a long time. And so she understands, story quickly. And she said, Fred, it's really simple. All you have to do is find somebody in the porn industry who will watch the Food Network with you, and then you can compare and contrast, right? And I was like, that is brilliant. That's the story. That's right. We'll figure it out that way. And so I went about and was like, how are we going to find this person? She was like, well, I work in Hollywood. You're from LA. We know people in the porn industry. And, they've all worked in the porn industry from way back. And so I was like, yeah, you're right. That's going to be easy. And so once again, 2 weeks go by. Nobody will fess up to ever having worked anywhere near, right? And I'm really dejected, and I'm walking my kids to elementary school one morning. My friend Andy is walking with me. He's like, Fred, what's the matter? And I tell him this whole story I've just told you. And he says, Fred, no problem. And that morning in the schoolyard of PS 234, he hooks me up. And that afternoon, I had like 50 emails from porn professionals all begging to be part of this story. Okay, and so then once I knew I could get into the Food Network, and I knew I had my expert, then I knew I had a story. So let's look. What I'd like to do is look at what precisely that story is, why I knew I had one at that moment, and the structure of what I did with those pieces, okay? And maybe this will give us a bit of an insight. So, Mark, this is the final product that appeared in Harper's Magazine in 2005. Okay, so there it is. Debbie does salad. I am not smart enough to have come up with that headline, but it really was a good one. The Food Network at the frontiers of pornography. And so, of course, stories, the structure of a story is, of course, three-part. There's three, and it's not beginning, middle, and end. No, it is not. But the first part of a story, stories always, always, always have to begin in a scene. That's the classic idea. And so, of course, I begin my story in the scene at the Food Network. So, Mark, can we just move down a little bit? So let's just take a look at these first two graphs. They would shoot the beauties at the end. The beauties is what they call the beauty shots of food that you see at the end of the Food Network shows, the close-ups, the zooming in, right? As if the food were the rapture or the apocalypse. In the meantime, there was choreography. I will add butter and shortening, said Sarah Moulton, who has hosted dump and stir television shows for 9 years and taped more than 1,000 segments. She stood in the middle of her mise-en-scene, a setup very much like the classic stove encounter of her mentor, Julia Child. I will give a few pulses of the food processor, Moulton continued. Add cheese, give 4 more pulses. I will then go to the fridge. I will get the apples. So in fact, it's interesting that my story about food begins with a scene in which Sarah Moulton is telling a story about food. More than a dozen people huddled around the star. There were the executive, assistant, and associate and culinary producers, the director and technical director, and the camera operators, production assistants, and food stylists. And there was Sarah Moulton's guest, Southern food scholar John T. Edge, in blue jeans and a chartreuse shirt, who could hardly wait to get on camera and show the world his apple pie. Okay, so obviously this is not a story. This is simply a scene. And so what I knew I had to do is set up a scene, bring us away from that scene, and then get us back to that scene. And that is kind of the basic idea of what I want to introduce to you today, is that basic element of how a story works and how, when we return to that scene, after we've gone away from that scene, that is what gives the reader or the person who's listening to this story or seeing the story that aha moment, that insight moment, that moment of returning and then seeing something that they've seen before again, informed by something else. Now, of course, writing is a linear media as opposed to, let's say, cartooning. In cartooning, of course, you see the foreground and the background all at the same time. In writing, you have to start by foregrounding something, move to backgrounding something else, and then return to the foreground. And it's that play, that structural play between the two, that's going to give you that insight, that aha, that moment of realization. Okay, so this is how it works. We start in a scene, and I just continue this scene. I don't do anything with it. I just explain the scene. So, Mark, can we then go to the big B? Okay, right here, Barbara. So I found Barbara Nitke as my expert in porn. So you can see, just a little bit up for a second, just a little, no, down, I guess, the other way. There we go. Perfect. So my first scene ends. Hi, I'm Sarah Moulton, executive chef of Gourmet Magazine. Today we'll explore the great American hamburger. Okay? That's it. And then, with no further ado, Barbara Nitke began her career as a porn still photographer in 1982 on the set of The Devil and Miss Jones Part 2, which had a crew of 25 and a budget of $100,000 and took 10 days to shoot. That was the longest shoot she ever worked on. These days, a typical porn director can create a feature-length video in a day for as little as $13,000, which kind of shows you how far we've come since 2005. Since Devil, Barbara Nitke has worked on the set of more than 300 porn films, which she said is not a huge number, considering that 10,000 new releases enter the market each year. Her most recent gig was with famed feminist porn director Candida Royale. Nitke shot the stills for Stud Hunters, images that ended up on the backs of video boxes, DVDs, and in the magazines. Over the years, her work has appeared in Swank, High Society, Leg Show, Climax, and Nugget. So, if you notice, there is this is not a middle in the sense that it's not a continuation of the Moulton story, nor is there any transition. A lot of people think, oh, there has stories about the transitions. No. It's just about, we've learned one thing in a scene, in a narrative, and now we have to understand what we call exposition. So we have narrative, exposition, and then the return to that same narrative. We can call it lots of different things. The academics call it text, context, text, or you could call it foreground, background, foreground, something like this, depending on the media or however you are doing it. So what I'm doing here with Nitke is just putting that scene, that original narrative scene, within a context, an expository context. So if we can just flip down to the next page, we start watching TV together, Barbara and I, and right around the banana, please. Okay, so we're watching Rachel Ray. So Barbara Nitke and I watched Ray Ray. Yeah, you know, that's what her fans call her. Do her perky act with a ripe tomato. I love just getting it, I'm sorry, I love just giving it a good smash with the palm of my hand, she bubbled, a good whack. Then I run my knife through it. Her glistening fingers closed around the dripping fruit. She is moist, Nitke noted. She gets her hands dirty. Okay, so in other words, all this is, once again, we're just sitting there watching TV. But what we're really doing is we're doing exposition. We're giving the reader, in this case, a context for understanding what is going on in the scene, which we will then return to. And so let's return to the scene. Let's just go to the very end of the story. Right there. And at the bottom, if you notice, right here at the bottom of the story, we are actually right back where we were at the beginning. What happened? There we go. Thank you. In other words, a lot of people think that a story needs a lot of tremendous dynamic movement, but actually it only needs structural movement. That's a key distinction, is that this story doesn't really go anywhere in time and place. It just starts in a scene, then structurally moves to the contextualizing of that scene or the exposition of that scene, then comes back to it. And so we can see when the pies moment, I'm looking at the last graph now, when the pies moment, he showed the world his apple pie, it was time to shoot the Great American Hamburger, and everyone's attention shifted to the sparkling monitors. PED 2 zoomed in on the onion-gilted sirloin beef, now topless and glistening tumescent, the better to penetrate the mind's eye. Jeff Kay and crew pushed forward, he's the director, the beautiful dead meat growing larger, ever larger, and as the director called his endless stream of numbers and the producers nodded in silent approbation, even Sarah Moulton had to stop and stare. After countless years in the business and a long day at work, this was the wow. So, what is a story? A story happens when we have a scene and we turn away from it and then we return to it. And when we return to it with that new knowledge, that is what gives the observer that sense of understanding, that deeper sense of that scene that they originally saw. And so really, and this goes very deep in the human psyche, because really what we're looking at is, what is a story? A story is, you are home, you go away from home, and then you come back. So thanks a lot. I'll talk to you later.